Hi, and welcome to this conversation today with Ann Harris and Jerry Bleem, a performance and conversation at the Riverside Arts Center in the FlexSpace. My name is Liz Chilson, and I'm the director of the FlexSpace at Riverside Arts Center. And I'm really happy to have all of you here with us today on this beautiful October day. It's an honor to have this conversation with Ann and Jerry. And Jerry's exhibition is in the gallery, both galleries at the Riverside Arts Center for another week, and then we'll have a book signing next Saturday afternoon as well, and we'll get you that information at the end of the conversation. So without any further questions, I'll just ask for you to share information in the chat if you would like, and then we will have a conversation with Ann and Jerry and performance and hear more about this wonderful exhibition and his work. And then we will unmute and have a conversation with everyone here with us today. So, and I'll just turn it over to Ann.
The first thing I want to do is just introduce myself and introduce Jerry. That'll be very quick. So obviously I'm Ann Harris. I'm an artist and also a teacher. I'm an associate professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in the painting and drawing department. And I've been a part of the Riverside Arts Center for a long time. I was a board member for a long time. I'm also been and still am the chair of their exhibition committee. So I've curated a number of shows here, including this one. I've known Jerry for a very long time. I first met him in 1998 at an artist residency in Roswell, New Mexico. And he and my family, my husband Paul and my son Max, we spent a lot of time together. I followed his work since then. Jerry is an artist. He has an MFA in fibers from the School of the Art Institute, and he has a long-standing career as an artist. He also teaches. So now he's my colleague as well. Initially we were not, and he teaches in the I don't know the full name of the department. Actually, it's the fiber department essentially at at SEIC. When we initially talked with Jerry about having this show, we discussed having a small retrospective, but as current events unfolded, Jerry asked if we could rethink that, and he had a body of work that he called Nationalism, and he was hoping to visit that in this exhibition, and so that's what we've done. With that, I'm going to bring Jerry into the conversation. I'm hoping this will work because Liz is now frozen on my screen, but I see Jerry moving, so I'm hoping he'll hear me. And what I'm going to do is ask Jerry to give us the history of this body of work, Nationalism, and just talk a little bit about it, and then we'll just start chatting. So, hi, Jerry, are you there? Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
I have to say that I'm not very fast at processing as an artist, so I really date the genesis of this body of work, the Nationalism series, to 2001, namely September the 11th, when the United States experienced something that it had never experienced before. And around those series of terrible events, and in response to those series of terrible events, what I noticed was a proliferation of the American flag. I was curious about the use of the flag because what I saw before as a use of the nation's emblem to sort of talk about the diversity of the country, it felt to me like that was being used in a more narrow sense, as just those observations were entering into my consciousness. And as the United States made the decision for military invasions in the Middle East, and as I had a nephew that was part of an army unit that was engaged in the Iraq War, I began thinking more and more about the way this emblem that is about a national identity really comes together, or really brings together two different sets of stories. So just listening to the news, there was a story that was very much about the nation and often presented in very dispassionate tones. You know, different decisions that the Congress had made, that the president had made, different ways that the war was being analyzed and how it would progress. But then there was a second set of stories about individual soldiers, and the individual soldiers whose lives were really affected by the decisions being made by the nation's leaders. And I mean intimately affected. Soldiers who were killed, soldiers who were maimed, soldiers who were coming back with post-traumatic stress disorders, and the families of those soldiers that had to process and deal with the results of their brothers and sisters and husbands and wives having their lives terminated and altered by the decision of their government to engage in this conflict. I thought about these as the public side and the private side of war. And I really began this series, this nationalism series, as a way to physically think through and bring together those two sets of stories. We can't deny, or we can't just let our hearts be moved by the terrible things happening to people. And frequently these human interest stories were conjoined with stories about their neighborhood or their town really reaching out at that moment. But, you know, as many of us, I think, could realize, losing a loved one or having a loved one terribly maimed, either physically or psychologically by war, does not ever change. You know, there's no going back, no amount of goodwill can bring that person to whom he or she was before they were as a part of this conflict. So I guess I felt like what was happening was much more complex than was being presented. And I wanted to really find a way to be reflective about the complexity. My work is often employing very non-precious materials in very non-monumental techniques, but with the addition of time. And for me, that time is a way to invest the product of my studio with meaning, but also to register the time it takes to make, which is for me a registering of the time it takes to think about. So that's really the genesis of this nationalism series. It's also a very important part of the series that I chose the flag of the United States in most cases, not in all cases, or references to the flag as a way to think this through. I think the flag has become so familiar to us that people often have a sort of quick, even unreflected reaction. And I wanted to reshape the surface, or take that material and reshape it in a way that is not as accessible, not as immediately accessible, but also something that can be recognized after a closer look or with greater consideration. And that kind of restructuring of the surface is also a part of the way that I think this series functions, to ask people to think through their presumed positions on a number of the issues that face the nation.
So, so I'm going to focus on a couple of things that you touched on at the end of what your was a complicated and thoughtful reply. You talked about time, and you talked about reflection. I guess it's more than two, it's three things: time and reflection. And you also talked about a restructuring of a surface. And so we should make clear for anyone who hasn't seen the show that the surface that you're talking about is an actual flag. And so your raw material for these pieces are flags. And then the restructuring, which is something you're doing right now, is a process that's called crochet. And so can we first start with this process, what you're doing right now, and maybe you can tell us what it is that you're doing, and then tell us exactly what you're using, the material that you're using.
All right.
And then we can kind of fold it back into the meaning of everything.
So in the textile world, or in textile techniques, there are a number of processes that are looping processes. So I am doing crochet, which is one of those looping processes. The other very familiar looping process is knitting. And all I'm doing is piling up individual loops in a structure. And the particular piece I'm working on is a very narrow surface that's only 6 crochet stitches wide. I'm using a very large needle, or a hook. It's really called a crochet hook. I'm using a very large hook to do that. And so you can see the structure, and you can even see the light through the structure. For me, the process is very reflective, or meditative, or contemplative, because once you have in your head the structure of the crochet, you can do it with a certain amount of mindlessness or lack of attention, but you have to be physically present. So I think of the process of crochet as a way of recording time, so that each of these loops takes place in a discrete moment. And the process of crocheting is a process of assembling time. For me, then, that carries in the art making a significance of being able to talk about a particular topic. And I certainly think the titles of my work invite a kind of reflection upon my consideration of the topic. So I'm working on a piece that's called Nationalism Draws a Line in the Sand. And it's really inspired by the long conversations we've had in the last couple decades in the United States about borders and boundaries, about how we draw lines to exclude people and include people. And certainly the USA-Mexico boundary or border has become a very charged place in the last 25 years of the nation's history. And it's always been a very charged place. So I think of the particular piece I'm working on as simply making a line, and a line that I want to make physical, but what also records the time that I've spent in thinking about the issue and thinking about the process. So, Anne, I don't know where I am in your question there, but
I'll just add to the question, or just point it. So you're doing it, you're using flags. So can you talk about exactly what you do to the flags? Talk about the exact flags or flag that you're using in this piece, and talk about why you're using a flag.
Another aspect of my work is that the gathering of materials is something I don't do alone. Majority of the material used in this exhibition and in this series has seen use. That is, I've gone to people and said, do you have flags you are willing to get rid of? And they're typically willing to get rid of them because they're faded or torn in some way. Now, I have purchased for some frequently at flea markets or at garage sales, And I prefer that they be used. I prefer that all the material I use be used. I think that use brings a history into my studio, a history that I can't control, a history I might not know, but a history that in some way marks the material. It's interesting to me, just in regard to flags, that the act of flying the flag, you know, the act of showing one's allegiance, the act of being patriotic is precisely the action that deteriorates the material. So many of the flags that are part of the work of this exhibition are faded. I have a flag that somebody tried to wash and the red ran into the white. So the white is a pale pink. I have used flags where the red has deteriorated to an orange, where the white has grayed or the white has become almost brown. And so those histories of being flown, being used, or simply being in somebody's drawer or storage for a long time marks the surface. And what I do to the surface is then cut it in pieces. And I'm going to show that the piece I'm using now uses a strip of a flag. And this rather large installation of the piece, whose title I cited, is a single flag. It was a flag that was being flown over a gas station. It was 25 feet wide. And I had a studio assistant who took the flag and cut it into a strip. It's about 1.25 inches wide. And so I'm using that flag as a way to make this piece. There's no other material, but there's the action of my crochet needle and the action of the time it takes to create this surface from what would be called, you know, stripped flag. You know, it's the process of cutting something into a strip.
But it's one strip. It's a continuous strip.
It's one continuous strip. I've cut flags in a variety of ways, but this particular flag is cut horizontally. Mm-hmm. So if you think of the flags as the stripes running horizontally, if it's being flown. So I started at the very bottom, or I should say my studio assistant started at the very bottom, and just cut all the way across, not all the way through, and turned again, so that there is a single long strip that this has been turned into. Huge balls in my studio. This was actually cut up when I was making this work. So much of the work of this series was made between 2006 and 2010. Mm-hmm. As Anne said at the very beginning, it was given what was happening in the country as the time to mount this show drew near that made me rethink our plan, made me feel like this idea of identity and the relationship between sort of these group decisions and the individuals involved needed to be brought out again. So this piece is new this summer, though the flag itself had been cut up previously. And, you know, as you can see, there's still, out of a huge ball of flag strips that I started with in June, actually, a bit of a ball left that I'm using for this performance today.
So you talked about public and private in terms of how the flag is experienced. And I'm going to see if I can tie this question back to nationalism. And I generally think, this is just me, sort of my train of thought, I generally think of nationalism as something that's broad. It's a kind of a public umbrella, but individuals in their reaction to a flag can have a nationalistic response. And then you also talked about people's responses to flags as being personal and having to do with their personal relationship to service, for example, as in soldiers who served in these wars and maybe came back they could have come back damaged, but they come back in whatever condition they're in response to that experience. And then, of course, there's each of us and how we experience this symbol, which stands for our country and is often understood to stand for patriotism. And you talked about getting flags that individuals would have used, say, to display in front of their homes, and how people who display those flags, especially every day, as opposed to just putting them up, Memorial Day, their flags get worn, sun faded, and or they might get stained, and so on. And then there's this flag that you're using to make this piece, and that flag was on top of a gas station. And so then we're back to something that is maybe public, and maybe that's actually a really different use of the flag, because it's not about the gas station owner's relationship to patriotism. It's about a presentation to the world about what this company stands for. So maybe, can you talk a little bit about different ways that you see the flag used and how it relates to us?
Well, and I think this is precisely what triggered the series that after 9/11, 2001, what I had associated the flag as a symbol of diversity and openness of dialogue and permission to disagree, and elections in effect are people selecting a standard, but after the election is over, the vast majority of people don't leave the country because they disagree with the person elected, whether that's at a state or national level. But this sort of idea that we will pull together and do what needs to be done for the good of the whole, even though we would see things differently and may not even have wanted the person elected. So after September the 11th, 2001, I felt like the flag was used to really narrow a conversation. There were instances where people were actually talking about why someone would have crashed a plane into a huge building and wanting to wreak a whole variety of destruction. And those sorts of conversations were shouted down because we were all supposed to believe one thing in that moment of national tragedy. And I understand that national tragedy does things to us that other periods in our history would have found us feeling differently and allowing for different sorts of dialogue. So for me, it is the complexity of the use of the flag that I thought was being ignored. And I think that is important. I like that you brought up this idea, this gas station flag. It's a marketing device. Those enormous flags that we can see sometimes at auto dealerships, sometimes at gas stations, or even some various industries, are certainly not just about saying, I'm behind the country, but it's about having people who drive by say, notice me. If you're a gas station, buy your gas here. If you're looking for a new car, buy your car here. I also am really fascinated by the way flags are used as decorative devices. Sometimes you'll pass a yard, often on a national holiday, where you have 40 or 50 flags put out. And it's about decorating the space more than it is about announcing some sort of nationalism or patriotism. I mean, what I'm technically doing by cutting up this flag is officially desecration. And the punishment for desecration is nothing. For a number of years, various laws have been introduced into the Congress to put some sort of punishment on people who desecrate the flag, but those bills have never passed. But I'd also like to say it's desecration to wear a t-shirt that has a printed flag on it. It's desecration for companies that put a little flag on their pants to do that. There is a particular law that allows public servants, firemen, policemen, police people, fire people, to put a flag on their uniform. There's a law passed that keeps that from being desecration. So there is a variety of ways that flags signal meaning. As Anne said, it could simply mean, you know, I was in the military and this is a sign for me of my comrades in service that I want to pay respect to, or I want to pay respect to people who've lost their lives beneath this flag or because of this flag. But sometimes it's just about catching other people's attention. Sometimes it is a marketing ploy. There's a piece in the show called Decorative Nationalism, where I take individual flags and turn them into these crocheted ruffle balls. Yeah. And it's about the way we use the flags as decoration.
Can you get Carlos to turn his camera to show that piece? It's in the window of the room that you're in. Yeah, maybe he can go like up and down and just back up a bit and we can see it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So these are like these little, they're adorable. They look like puff balls, but they're actually much more dense, and they're very kind of anthropomorphic. When we were setting them up, we were talking about one, oh, this one's lying down. This one's crawling over the edge. And each one
the
of
other
those
thing,
flag.
Yes, each one is a different flag, an individual flag. Each one has been stripped and then crocheted into this surface.
Yeah. And so while
the other thing that, okay,
while Carlos is at it, can he also just show us the kind of the full scale of this piece? He can go up and over, and maybe
Carlos,
also
maybe you can show the height of the installation for this piece.
Yeah, and maybe move over to the other side and show the top of that.
And then go to the other side.
Right, and then can he go down and show the piece on the floor and how it comes toward us?
And the piece on the floor, particularly as it comes toward the front of the gallery.
Right, just as I want people to, it's hard to tell because scale shifts when we're looking with zoom. Things can sort of look like toys. But this piece actually very gesturally expands through the gallery. It was interesting to hang it because I know you had an initial idea about it being relatively flat against the wall, and then we realized it was much more interesting if it was not symmetrically hung and if it was also more dimensionally hung, and so we sort of twisted it and played with where it went. And
well, and I had worked with it probably a foot or two at a time, so that length of this long line, which is well over 60 feet long. I mean, the last time I measured it is 60 feet, so it's got to be longer. That doesn't have much flexibility in a foot or 2 foot of length. But when you start talking about the 60 feet, it has a drape to it, which I really didn't realize until we started installing. As Anne mentioned, you know, I pictured this going up one wall and down the other, and but I thought it would behave more like a stiff line. And once we got its whole length out into the studio, it really hung itself more as a drape, which I think, you know, refers to the ways that sometimes we take bunting and put it into these sort of swags of color to decorate. So
yeah. So what I'm seeing, you know, I had this sort of list of questions that I even went over them a bit with Jerry beforehand. We're sort of like naturally segueing into these different questions. So that, I mean, there are some things that I could go on and on about nationalism, and I wrote that whole catalog essay about it. But since we
Mhm.
started talking about, again, about the piece itself and the installation, um, I'd actually like to begin to talk about this as works of art.
Mhm.
And so we have the, we have your idea for the work, and how you initially began to ponder it and sort of mull it over, and then how you began to uh, work on it over time. I think that you said the first piece that you finished, you didn't say in the conversation, but in other talks that you and I have had, the first piece in this series that you resolved was in 2006.
Right.
So you mulled it over and then began working on it, and it was a kind of 5-year process before this work began to actually physically exist. But it exists not just as a kind of representation of an idea. They exist as these physical objects, and you can not exactly tell in Zoom. You've got a kind of vague idea, but they also exist as objects that are beautiful. They have a relationship to well-crafted objects that have existed for historically for a long, long time. And then they have a quality of color that comes from this weathering, and there's a quality of surface. They look very touchable. It's surprising when you do touch them because they don't feel the way you'd expect, because they're actually made of these synthetic material, because they're these crappy flags, right? But they have this look like they would feel fantastic, and then they're existing as art on the wall in a very particular way, and we got to really play with that in the art center space. And so this is leading into me asking you, what changed for you when you saw the work go up in the Freeark Gallery and in the FlexSpace, which is where you are? Did anything change for you in terms of how you understood the work?
I think it changed from the perspective of how I wanted the viewer to see it. Now, this big piece I'm working on now, and this largish installation, is something I'd never installed before. And I had, thought about how it would be installed. And we initially started in the Freeark galleries, and the space wasn't right. It wouldn't do what I wanted it to do. We came to the FlexSpace, and it was really wonderful that the Riverside Arts Center let me have this exhibition in both spaces, and it almost hung itself. The scale of the gallery was perfect for the piece, and so I learned so much about the presentation of the piece, the one I'm working on now, by simply having a specific gallery space in which to use it. The idea of installation is very different from just using a gallery as a kind of neutral space. To use work that is installed means a kind of relationship between the gallery space or the presentation space. It certainly doesn't need to be a gallery, and the object itself, and an integration of those two. Like, one is not to predominate over the other. The FlexSpace gallery really determined the way this piece is presented, and certainly it will be a different piece in different spaces. That was very interesting. The other thing is that I had really left this series behind in 2010. I moved on to another series and have been well immersed in that for nearly a decade now. And so seeing this work anew really was allowing it to be recontextualized by what has happened in the world, but especially in the United States of America during the last 10 years. So the work that was done between 2006 and 2010 was really done with this experience of the nation being at war. And then, I come upon work in 2020, and what is something I believe I need to consider, which is why I really make this work as an act of meditation or contemplation, is this idea of border and how we exclude and include. Certainly, the last 4 years have witnessed the dialogue in this country about excluding people. And so making a line, making a really long line, a line that was more flexible than I really realized it was in the making, really let me think about the series in a different way. Also, Anne, as you know, that I had shown this work in a variety of ways. The decorative nationalism series that Carlos just showed us, I've always shown on flat surfaces. I've always shown on pedestals. And you were the one that suggested, well, what if these are on the wall? And they become less of an object that decorates a space in the same way that we take objects of comfort and put them around in our living spaces. And they became much more animated. And as you described, we were giving them anthropomorphic quality. Oh, this one's sleeping. Oh, this one's crawling. And so I have experienced that piece in a very different way than I'd ever experienced it before. And there's another piece, Nationalism Strategy, which I always thought is a kind of board game and showed on the floor. And so your suggestion that this could be hung on the wall, gave it a kind of, for me, a graphic presence that I'd never seen in it before. So I think having a very specific place to display, and the whole process of editing the body of work, there was lots of work I took home because this work, we really felt, filled the gallery and would let the viewer experience the work at a pace that we thought was respectful for the work and respectful to the viewer. So that's part of how, my response to the work has changed by revisiting it, but also by having a very specific place to exhibit it in.
So I have two more questions. Because we started late, I'm looking at the clock and thinking, okay, we're going to go a bit late. One is, one is an art question, and the other ties back into the subject of nationalism. So my art question, let's see, I had it strongly in my mind, so let's see if I can keep it straight. It's more like an observation, and I'll ask you to just respond to it, which is, it strikes me that you've taken a flag, which is a symbol, or it can also be understood as a sign, but it's a thing. It stands for a kind of, it stands for, it can stand for our country, it can stand for attitudes about our country, it can stand for patriotism, but it is without doubt a kind of symbol or sign. And then you take this flag and you literally take it apart and use it as the raw material for art. It's my opinion, maybe not all artists will think of it this way, that fundamentally art is a transformation of material. And that transformation is key. And that what the art then becomes is something else, which can range from sign or symbol to a metaphor, which is something else. It doesn't simply stand for something, it becomes something. And so it's my opinion that your work actually goes from being literally in its material a symbol to becoming a metaphor. And the metaphor is for for the complexity of the subject. And also for just a kind of experience that we can both get while contemplating the subject, but we can also get it when we just contemplate a work of art. That is, we look at it, we look into it, we take in the time that it took as it was made, it interacts with our senses, we feel it. We don't just see it or think about it. So anyway, I'll put that there. And then my next question is, you chose to open this up now. And can you talk a little bit about that and why?
Well, I think the events that have been taking place in the nation, and I'm referring to, you know, the publicly videoed death of George Floyd, that in 2020, this kind of behavior against an African-American man could take place was just a huge disappointment for me. I think we as a nation are not as far along in understanding our prejudices as I thought we were, you know, and I have to say that our ability to be biased and prejudiced has really frightened me and offended me. The process by which people have been protesting that and then continuing to cite other instances where people of color, most notably, have been violently handled and killed, made it feel like this was the time not to do some sort of wide-ranging retrospective, but to really rethink how we identify as people of a particular nation and what we want this nation to be. I think the idea that exclusion is part of the national identity is a horrible thought for me, because the nation was founded on an idea of inclusion. It was a very limited idea, you know, it basically was limited to white men. But in the 200 plus years after that, certainly our idea of inclusion has broadened. You know, we have been made aware of gender, been made aware of race, been made aware of what our forefathers have done to enslave people, you know, literally, but also in all kinds of clever and not so clever financial ways. And I just think I, as an artist, had to say something about what was happening in the present year, in the present moment. You know, I'm far less afraid of the COVID-19 pandemic than the way I'm seeing fellow citizens act. It says to me that the era of the internet and having access to everybody's iPhone images simply is able to make me aware of these instances, and they were probably just always going on. But the last 5 months have been a frightening time for me in this country, because they have revealed how amazingly prejudiced and biased we are, and how in a certain way we are unwilling to change that. So, I mean, that's why I felt like this was the series to show now, and that's why I felt like I had to make some new work this summer for this exhibition.
Okay. So I'm looking at my clock. It's 2:54. I know we started almost 10 minutes late. I don't have a problem with going a few minutes over if you and Liz are okay with this, but I think it's time to open it up to questions so that our audience can join in. And I'll let Liz figure out how to do that.
Thanks. I think what I'll do is just ask everyone to unmute your video if you would like. If you don't have to, we are recording this, so you don't have to unmute your video if you prefer not to. And you can unmute your audio if you'd like to ask a question. And we do have one question that came in the chat, which is, what is the series you were working on in the past decade? It's a question for Jerry. And where do you see your reintroduction? Where do you see your reintroduction of the flag series going in the future?
So the past decade, I've been working on a series that are made out of single-use plastic bags. And, you know, that seemed to be something of the moment. I'm really interested as well in the way that the natural resources of the earth are being used with a certain amount of lack of attention. So, though in Chicago, the single-use plastic bag had, its accessibility had been greatly diminished. Certainly now with COVID, when you go to the grocery store, your groceries are being, you know, bagged again in these single-use plastic bags. So the last decade, I've really focused on a whole variety of work that is made out of the plastics that we just expect are going to be around and accessible to us. And they're so easy to use and so easy to dispose of, but we don't see them as petroleum products. And that, you know, are, because we can afford them, somehow we believe that they should be accessible to us. So that was what I've been working on. And I'm actually just beginning to move out of that into exploring some book formats. But as I said, you know, what was happening in our nation the last 5 months really felt like I couldn't ignore that in this exhibition. I mean, I'm really grateful for the Riverside Arts Center for giving me this space and really challenged me to think about what's the work of the moment that needs to be shown and what that I need to be addressing.
Oops, hey Liz, you're still muted.
Thank you. So there's another question about the meaning behind this, and certainly Jerry's upcoming work, including plastic bags, are both profound. I'm wondering about a vehicle for communicating this work to a broader Riverside audience, but also beyond.
I have just come out of a time where my religious community has asked me to do a number of jobs. So my time to sort of show the work has been very limited in the last 9 years. So I'm hoping.
We should mention that you're a Franciscan friar,
Right,
and a priest. Right.
So I belong to a religious community in the Catholic Church called the Order of Friars Minor, more colloquially called the Franciscans. And I've had some jobs. I was on a governance board and just finished 9 years serving on that. And that was 3 terms of election, and I can't be reelected. So I feel like now I have some time to return to art making. I think both of those sorts of series that are well fleshed out, the idea of how nationalism affects us and how use of material affects us, especially disposable, and that which we so blithely dispose of, are really important things that are facing the country and facing the world. This is the 5th year of Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si that really calls Catholics to see that their relationship to the earth is an important one, and that the earth is not something for us to dominate and use, but to live in relationship with. So both of those series, I think, are still current. The series I'm working on now really rests upon my interest in pattern, which, so as a person who's always studied textiles and been fascinated by textiles, I've always been interested in pattern as a communicative device, and also the sequencing of books. And so I'm trying to combine those two as a way to bring a kind of tactile book into creation. And I occasionally make books. There is in the catalog a book that's part of the Nationalism series. So I've been in and out of bookmaking that I've employed that format when it seems like it fits the subject that I want to address. But now I would really like to study books and the format of books a little more intensely and a little more fully through these eyes of being someone who's interested in textiles.
There's another question. I have a question about the intimacy of the process and the relation between the domestic of the home and the domestic relating to nationalism. Can you talk about the intimacy of the process and how it may complement or complicate these locations?
I hope that the work has this sense of somebody spending time. You know, I talked about how the looping technique of crochet locates a moment of time when that loop was formed. So I really hope that a viewer comes to see the work and thinks about the thoughtfulness that the physical object represents. You know, I'm not here to take a particular political stance and stamp my feet and argue with people. And I'm also not here to offend people who think that my cutting up of the flag is a terrible act of desecration. I'm here to say we've got to get more thoughtful about this. We have to think more deeply about this. We can't be satisfied with our conversations, our national dialogue, which seems to be reduced to phrases thrown at each other. So that's really a concern I have in the making of this work. I think that idea of an invitation to conversation and to not be afraid of the complexities of that conversation. You know, Anne talked before about flag as symbol, and the validity of symbols is that they hold multiple meanings. You know, my response to any sort of symbolic object or symbol is not going to be determined by everybody else agreeing to the same meaning of that symbol. And so I think that in the same way that the flag shows a kind, or can hold a group of people together in a variety of meaningfulnesses, so too that we as a people need to have the ability to navigate some very complex topics without trying to oversimplify them or disregard people who seem to talk about the same topic in a different way.
Because the thing I've been thinking about for a while with the work, Jerry, is something that maybe dovetails to something you were just saying. But I want to ask it in a different way. It's like, I want to talk about point of view. So the work started in 2001, and your relationship to the flag and the country and what motivated this work had to do with us being an external issue, us being attacked. And now more recently, the problems are all internal. And as you just eloquently said before, you know, George Floyd and your concerns about what's going on with this virulent reemergence of a racism that was always there has made you even more concerned. So I'm wondering how that point of view has shaped the newer work versus the older work. And you did talk about the desecration of the flag as maybe something that someone would see as a point of view, but you're not saying that's enough. So how has that point of view kind of caused the work to look differently or read differently?
I think this installation piece is a good example of how there's been difference. And by that I mean the former work was more discreet. It could hang on a neutral kind of wall and be seen as an object. And this piece that I've just finished is much more expansive. It's, you know, it fills up this space. And I think that would be the way I talk about the point of view from a different perspective. You know, we had this question of domestic, and I think the domestic versus the public are venues in the nation's life that we don't really attend to, and that it's an extremely important conversation to see them as not as seeing them related rather than unrelated. And when I talk about noticing the way the flag was used differently after September 11th, 2001, that difference didn't remain static. But as we entered into war, it changed again. And I think as we enter into this time in our nation's history where our racism has become blatant, I mean, the use of the flag has been reduced almost. After September the 11th, 2001, it was amplified. I felt like you couldn't turn around without running into a flag. And now people don't know what they mean by using it, or question what they mean, or are hesitant to use it. So the material itself that this national series deals with certainly has evolved in my experience. And of course, that's the other part of the conversation. It's only my experience. I'm sure other people have understood the use of the flags in very different ways, and what the flag means to them differs. That answer your question, Paul? You buy that?
Yes, I guess.
Yeah. Yes.
I have a question if we still have time. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I thought it was really striking the way you talked about the sort of nexus of making these flag pieces, and it, like both times, both at September 11th and 2020, in talking about George Floyd, like Paul was saying, there are both such times of trauma that it's striking to me. When I first heard about what you were going to be doing in the galleries, I thought like, oh gosh, I wonder if it's going to seem irreverent to rip flags. And so thinking about that, and then thinking about the process of crocheting, I'm wondering about the process in terms of something restorative. Because I remember quite well, seeing all the flags around September 11th, and then there was such emotion, at the time, rightly so, but that then, and it was like our, public sphere was so saturated with flags that it seemed to me that when the flag was like not enough, the symbols went to the eagle with talons. And, it was this like really like sort of desperate attempt to talk about nationalism in this way that, the symbols had symbols, and the eagle had a flag, and it was just the sort of this compounding of both symbolism, the symbolic, and then the real. So I'm wondering if you're thinking about the crocheting as a restorative process in this symbolic realm, maybe on par and akin to a symbol of the gesture of the flag in a public space, or in one's front yard, or something like that.
I think we are at a time when we think much more about vengeance or retribution. I suspect that's sort of a natural human response to attack, whether that attack is a verbal one or a physical one. But I do think if we find a way to move from retribution or vengeance to restoration, that's going to be the way we're going to make progress. And you bring up this really wonderful point, Stephanie, that at some point the finger pointing has to stop, and the acknowledgement of the scars has to begin. I don't think the nation has done anything when it comes to recognizing the generation-long set of scars inflicted by slavery. We've done, there's been some talk about retribution say it again.
Reparations.
Reparations. Thank you. I thought we're out of my head. For reparations, but we don't acknowledge what that has done to generations of people. That slavery doesn't end with the Emancipation Proclamation. That what we've done to human psyches in that process is still a burden to the nation that we don't talk about. So, I mean, I think the idea of restoration is the way we have to go. It's the only way we're going to make substantive progress. You know, the finger pointing is going to accomplish nothing. And our protecting ourselves and saying, well, I wasn't there, well, I didn't do it, or my ancestors didn't do it, that excluding ourselves from the activity that's going to restore us to greater wholeness is simply not going to serve anyone.
So I wanted to make sure I'm on here. I wanted to, we're now at 3:11. I wanted to ask if there was one more question, and then we end it. And if there are none, we can end it now. But yes.
Hi, I just wanted to sort of build on what both Stephanie and Jerry were talking about in terms of restorative work in our world, in our country, what's needed, and building on my first question, which was, how are we getting this to a broader audience? I feel like work like yours, Jerry, and others, and conversations like this are happening. They're happening, but they're happening among some of the same circles of people and some of the same types of people. So I think that's really at the heart of what I was trying to say, is that if there's a way, a vehicle by which, and perhaps it's digital, as much as I hate to say, oh, Instagram or something like that, there's got to be a way to reach a bigger group of thinkers that could perhaps think outside the spectrum of where their head has been for all too long. So I guess that's where I'm at. It's just sort of an open-ended question, not something for anyone to answer here right now, but I just want to applaud you and thank you again for doing this.
Thank you.
So thank you, Jerry. I wanted to mention that his show keeps going. It's up until the 17th, and we're gonna we have a catalog that we've made, and Jerry and I are going to be doing a signing on Saturday, the 17th. And actually, I should know the time, but I don't know. Did we sell? What was that?
From 3:30 to 5, Saturday in the sculpture garden.
Okay. And so I wanted to tell you all, please join us. We'd love to see you again, and especially if you haven't seen the show in the flesh, please do see it. The work is very special in person, and the fact that it's handmade, it was touched while it was made, has a relationship to how you experience it when you see it in the flesh. And you'll be happy if you come see it. And we are practicing social distancing, so there's a kind of limit to who can be in the gallery, how many people at once. It's loud outside, so I hope that you all can hear me. And that's all I'll say. I'll turn it back to Liz or Stephanie and to close it out.
Thank you. I'll close it out for it. Paul, are you going to play us a song? Going to play us out. I really want to thank everyone for coming. This has been really great. And so the book signing is next weekend, and it'll be out in the galleries, so we'll be social distancing, but it's not by appointment, isn't necessary. Otherwise, in the gallery, we're open from 1 until 5 on Thursday through Saturday by appointment. So, and mask wearing is required. So,
yeah.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
You.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Liz, also.
Oh, you're welcome.
You're great.
Hi, everybody.